Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Mountain Musings. As you can see by my shirt, today's kind of fallish. We got up this morning and it was 52 degrees up here. And I'm not complaining. I have had enough of hot weather in my lifetime, so I like the cool mountain weather. But it was a bit brisk this morning when we got up. But it's a beautiful sunny day, kind of breezy. You may hear the wind blow and see what's left of my hair wave in the breeze. But today we're going to talk about something. We're going to explore an idea that is probably the most difficult idea that we've looked at. Most of the time, most of the things that we've looked at, our culture is pretty comfortable with. We've been looking at what it means to be a good husband, other discipleship things. And for the most part, our culture wants us to be a good husband. They don't put a lot of stock in it, but they would rather us be good than bad. But this subject that we're going to explore today, the subject that we're going to talk about, is a subject that, frankly, our culture does not embrace. It's a subject that our culture heaps disdain upon. And it's not a new thing that our culture dislikes this. No culture has ever liked this subject. This is one of those things that it's the reminder that you and I are just, we're failed. And this is the concept of loving your enemy. So this is Discipleship, episode number 3, Loving Your Enemy. And something I want to make sure that you understand is that this is not something that I have figured out. This is something that I struggle with. I still have a tendency to look at those who are not like me, who disagree with me, as my enemy. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'll have to admit that this is something that's hard, very hard. I want to read from a passage in Matthew. I'm reading from the King James Version. As an old English teacher, there are times in which I really like the King James. I mean, there are passages which they got right, passages which they nailed. This is one of those. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44, King James Version. Pray for them that despitefully use you. Those are hard words. Words that, for the most part, we tend to say, well, that was Jesus speaking, and it's a nice thing to think about, but it's not something that we can really do, and it's not something that's practical in this world in which we live. And you're right, it's not practical. And I do believe that aside from the help of the Holy Spirit, it's not something that we can really do. But all too often, I fear that as Christians, we've just embraced our culture. And we've just said, well, that's a nice platitude, but it doesn't work. But it is what Jesus has called us to. And it is what Jesus did himself. And it's how he wants us to live. When I was teaching at a parochial school, I was called upon to do the morning devotion before we started off our professional development one day, before school started, about a week out. And I chose as my passage Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And that goes like this. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, English Standard Version. And the point of my devotion was that we were called to do something different. And the problems that we faced in our classroom were not the product of unruly students, disrespectful students, rebellious students, unsupportive parents, even political parties. Those weren't our problems. Our problems, the enemy that we faced, the true enemy, was spiritual in nature. It were the spiritual forces that are arrayed against us. And after the devotional, one of my friends, and someone I still count as a friend, was very agitated with me. And he said, "Well, Matt, I have enemies, and they are flesh and blood." And with that, he wheeled about and walked away, bringing our conversation to an abrupt end. And I fear that that is all too often our response. That we embrace this concept that our enemies are flesh and blood. You see, in our current social and political realm, we've embraced this concept that those who disagree with us are our enemies. Now, as a soldier in Iraq, I fought against enemies. I know what an enemy is, what they look like. I've been rocketed, IED'd, shot at, and returned fire. There were men and women, mostly men, who actively sought to take my life. Those are enemies. We've broadened the category of enemy to include simply anyone who disagrees with us, who seeks to do something differently. We say, well, those are my enemies. And we like this easy cultural choice of A or B. We like binary. It's either A or B, black or white, friend or foe. And we like that because it makes life simple. Either you agree with me and we are friends and allies, or you disagree with me and I don't have to listen to you because you're my enemy. And in fact, I can say pretty much whatever it is that I want to say about you. I was engaged with in a conversation with an acquaintance of mine, not really a friend, just an acquaintance, but someone who counts himself as a Christian, and they were justifying lying on social media. They had put out some things that in memes that were not true, and I had said, "Hey, that's not accurate what you're putting out. You might want to reconsider." No, this is war, was their response. And in war, you can do things like that. And this is someone who would check the box of Christian. They consider people who disagree with them, who are seeking to do something different than they're doing, as their enemy. And Paul argues for a different way of looking at things. He says, remember, our enemy is not flesh and blood. Our enemy is spiritual in nature. And as Christians, we really need to embrace this concept. You see, according to Paul, my enemy is not flesh and blood. My enemy is spiritual. Now, when I was in Iraq, my enemy sought to kill me through a wide variety of means. And in fact, we exchanged fire. I didn't know them, they didn't know me, but we were on the other sides, and so we tried to kill one another. And in fact, I have stood over the body of my slain enemy in the street and rejoiced that it was him and not me. And in so doing, I displeased the Lord. I had embraced our cultural idea that it's okay to do what you want to your enemy. And the Lord calls us to a different viewpoint. In Proverbs, he says, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and turn his anger away from him. Proverbs 24:17 and 18. Now, I'm not saying that I was wrong to engage in combat. That's a discussion for a different time and a different place. But I am saying that God calls us to look at our enemies differently than our culture would have us look at them. In our cultural context, when our enemy has a setback or falls or stumbles, we rejoice. Ha ha! They got what's coming to them. And God says, ooh, don't do that. Because that displeases the Lord. So, how you and I view our quote unquote enemies is important. How we react when they run into the inevitable struggles of life is important. We're going to look at some of what Jesus says about this in just a moment. Yes, it's cool enough for me to be drinking some coffee out here on the deck, which is nice. In Luke chapter 6, verses 35 and 36, in which many theologians would say is a parallel passage to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, but love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and it will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Luke 6:35-36. Jesus calls us to a radically different way of looking at the world and a radically different way of doing things. He says, be kind, be merciful, lend, knowing that they're going to abuse you. And honestly, folks, that's just, I struggle with that. If someone comes against me, someone that I identify as being antagonistic toward me, I'm not inclined to lend them. I'm not inclined to be merciful to them. But Jesus says that's what you need to do. Be merciful, even as your heavenly Father is merciful. Later on, Paul is going to say in Romans chapter 5, verse 10, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life. Romans 5 and 10. The thing that I want to take from this passage is the reminder that God loved me first. I didn't reach out to him first. He reached out to me first. He sought me. He loved me even when I raised my fist in rebellion. God looked at me and loved me. And he calls me to assume a similar lifestyle, a lifestyle in which I love those who hate me and I love them first. And he reminds me that I need to be merciful as he is merciful, and that he loved me first. So when I look out there and I see someone who is doing something that I find despicable, is behaving in a way that I find reprehensible, or embracing a lifestyle that I find loathsome, I'm called to love them, to do good to them, to be merciful to them, to lend to them. And frankly, I just don't do that very well. But that's what I'm called to do. As a disciple of Christ, I am called to love those who I find unlovable. And I'm reminded by the Lord that, hey, dude, I loved you first. And I loved you when you were despicable to me, when you were mired in selfish, ambitious sin, when you were my enemy. I loved you. So I ask you to consider. Think of those who you would label as your enemy. And then think of, how can you love them? How can you show love to the unlovable? How can you be merciful to those who desperately need mercy? And how can you be gracious to the rude and unpleasant? These are all difficult things. And do not for a moment think that I've got this down. This is something that God is still working out in my life. But I do know it's what He calls me to do. And I do know that this is a mark of a disciple. A disciple of Christ is able to love those who are his enemies. So, as always, thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your comments, which help. And please, if you want to read the written version of this, I'll put the link in the description. And as always, leave suggestions. Help me get better at what I'm trying to do. So, have a good day, and from Cloudcroft, good afternoon.